All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm very excited about what we're going to look at today. John chapter 9, the story of Jesus healing the man born blind. And I think that this is going to help us in a number of ways. It's going to help us in terms of the meta-narrative. How do we come to a story and look at the meta-narrative details? I think we should be in a much better place to understand that, to understand the whole issue of blindness and sight in the Bible. And then maybe the most important point is how we look at physical suffering. Is it somehow opposed to God's will, or how should we think about that? And so I think we're going to have a wonderful time this morning. As always, make sure you take quiz 11. It's hard to believe, but this is actually 25% of the semester is over after today. I mean, we're halfway to midterms if you're in a class with a midterm. So please take attendance quiz 11. We are looking at Jesus and the man born blind. I hope you've been able to work through the text in your homework. I appreciate the good work that you're doing there. So what we're going to see, kind of just to step back in the main points, that Jesus in this passage teaches that we are all born spiritually blind, and to see we must wash in the sent one. So in terms of the meta-narrative of Scripture, Jesus in a gracious way wants to correct the misunderstanding of his own disciples that somehow people who are suffering physical illnesses are somehow more sinful than they are. Rather, Jesus is trying to help his disciples embrace the truth that every single one of us is born spiritually blind. And the only way any of us will ever see is to wash in the one having been sent. And a second thing we really want to look at this morning is that Jesus teaches that physical suffering is not to be thought of as direct judgment, but rather as an opportunity for God's glory. When you look at the challenges that you have in your own life, the reason those challenges are there, Jesus doesn't want you to focus on things, the fall, Adam, things like. Jesus wants you to look at that and say, this is an opportunity for God's glory. And so we're going to look at those two things in our hour together. And this is how the passage starts. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, in some ways, the disciples should have known better. This, in some ways, is a ridiculous question for someone to ask because it goes against the entire teaching of the Old Testament. None are righteous, no, not one. Noah found grace in God's eyes. What's the result of that? Noah was a righteous man. Can an Ethiopian change his skin? Can a leopard change his spots? And so too you, who are accustomed to be evil, can make yourself good. That can't be done. The assumption that the disciples are making here is a completely wrong assumption. And yet Jesus is so gracious as a teacher, he doesn't call out their ignorance. Rather, he does what in many aspects is an acted parable. That is, he does something very strange that in time the disciples are going to look back and realize, oh my goodness, Jesus was graciously helping me to realize a difficult truth about myself, but he did it in a gracious way. I know I had a friend like this once. I had an opportunity to speak in for me, a pretty large church, and I was very excited to preach the three uh, um, times that morning. And I had a friend in that church who dearly loved me, and I loved him, a great friend. I really appreciate him. And he was talking to me before the service, and he said, "Can I give you a gift?" And I was kind of taken back by that, but I said, "Sure, you can give me a gift." And he said, "Close your eyes and hold out your hands." And so, I'm getting pumped up, ready to speak at this church, but I was willing to play along, and so I held my hands out and shut my eyes, and I could feel something going in my hands, and I looked up, and it was about 150 lifesavers. My friend was trying to tell me something. My friend was trying to tell me that, "Hey, bud, you have really bad breath this morning. You may want to do something about it." But he did it in a gracious way. And so I looked down and I kind of laughed, and he laughed, because he had effectively communicated something graciously to me. That's what Jesus is doing here. What the disciples are saying is completely misguided. And Jesus wants to correct it, so he corrects it by this acted parable. They're assuming that this man's physical difficulty was either because his parents were these just super rotten people, or else this man had somehow sinned so bad while in the womb that God struck him down with blindness from birth. That's what they're assuming. And that is dead wrong, according to the scriptures. And Jesus wants to kindly help them realize their error. So this is what's going on. This is a picture of the Temple Mount. If you think about the quadrangle at Bryan College, that's probably about the same size. Imagine a beautiful structure with limestone blocks. Some of those blocks are 26 feet long. Think of kind of the most inviting mega church you've ever been into, and that's kind of what's going on here. And Jesus and his disciples were going in the front door of the temple area, and it was at that front door that people would sit and beg. And so this man was sitting and begging as the good people, the healthy people, however you want to call it, were going in to worship God at this beautiful place. The people who had nothing were at the door, and they were begging for their livelihood. And as Jesus' disciples are walking in, they say of this blind man, was it that he was such a rotten, terrible, ungodly sinner, or was it that his parents, because one of those two truths have to be true? And Jesus is saying, no, you've got that completely wrong. It's interesting when you start thinking about blindness and what Jesus is saying and teaching here, that theme in the Bible goes all the way back to the Adam and Eve story. Genesis 3:1, the serpent was more crafty than any beast in the field which the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Indeed, has God said you will not eat from any tree of the garden?" The woman said, from the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat from it or touch it. Now, I don't know where she got that. I don't know if this is the beginning of legalism in the Bible, but God never said anything about not touching the fruit either she or Adam added that to what God had said. And then she says, or you will die. The serpent said to the woman, you will surely not die, for the Lord knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened. So the very first temptation in the Bible carries with it the promise that if you give in, your eyes will be opened. And it's interesting, when they eat, their eyes are open. They can see that they're naked now and that they're shameful. But the odd thing is, they can't see God anymore. Their eyes are open to the reality of this world, but they lose the ability to see God. And you can see that the result then from this very first sin is a spiritual blindness. That their eyes are open, but they become incapable of seeing the spiritual world. Paul says it this way: their minds were hardened, for to this day when they read the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted. They can't see what God is revealing in his word, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. It's a spiritual blindness. It's a heart blindness. But when someone turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. The Bible is all about helping us realize that every person, every natural born son or daughter of Adam, in fact, suffers inherently from spiritual blindness. And so, when the disciples are walking in this beautiful sanctuary and they're judging this man and saying he's bad and we're good. Yes, we may have sin, but our sin is little compared to that man, because look at his situation in life. Obviously, he's some kind of horrific, abominable sinner, and we aren't that. And Jesus is kindly helping them realize that that just isn't true. We all suffer from spiritual blindness, and we see it that that God can open eyes. God opened her eyes and she saw. The Lord opened the eyes of Balaam and he saw. Elisha prayed and said, "Oh Lord, I pray, open his eyes." Elisha is saying they're more for us than against us in the sermon. It says it's just you and me. And Elisha prays and he sees that they're surrounded with the army of the Lord. The psalmist prays, "Open my eyes that I may behold wonderful things from your law." We all suffer a spiritual blindness. And when the disciples of Jesus were looking at this man at the door of the temple, they saw a man who had suffered years of not being able to see. And they could see that his life was a miserable life. And they're judging him. They're assuming that somehow that blindness is because of his personal sin, and they're assuming that they haven't sinned like that man. And Jesus is wanting, in a kind way, to communicate and say that isn't true. Don't think of it that way. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus is correcting that idea. He's correcting an idea that the disciples have, that they are basically good people. He's trying to help them see that we're all spiritually born blind. all, if left to ourselves, would fall into tremendous evil. And Jesus is also wanting them, when they see suffering, not to think of it as judgment from God, but rather as an opportunity for God's glory. Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned, or his parents, but it was that the works of God might be displayed in him." Now, I want to offer just an application here today about this truth, and I want to say a few examples, and then I want to try to connect with you personally about this truth. All of us have issues in our lives. In a room this size, more than likely, there are many people who have suffered at the hands of others. And some of that suffering has been horrific. Some of that suffering has been inflicted by the very people who should bring you the greatest good in life. And that suffering, in many ways, is like you're driving a car and you smash into a brick wall at 200 miles an hour. Because of what you have suffered, there are things that you struggle with in your life that you should never have to struggle with. And the temptation is to feel like God hates me. The reason this has happened to me is because God hates me. And Jesus says, God doesn't hate you, God loves you. And this challenge is going to be an opportunity for God's glory to shine. If statistics are true, many of you have been touched by a home that's been broken from divorce. In some cases, that divorce may be of non-Christians, and many cases it's Christians who just can't live together anymore. And you, as a child of divorced parents, perhaps carry around guilt and believe, oh, this is somehow my fault. I contributed to drive my parents apart. It's tempted to feel victimized. And Jesus would say, this is going to be an opportunity for God's glory. I want to share just some stories to think about. God's glory in spite of suffering. This man at the door, if he had sat there, if he was 30 years old when this happened, he had heard his entire life people make comments like this. He had gone through his entire life with little boys coming, and if you have a can or something there to collect money, or a clay jar, he knew what it was like for somebody to kick that over. He knew what it was like for little kids to laugh at him, to play tricks on him. He'd experienced that his entire life. And Jesus is saying to this man in his miserable suffering condition, this man is about to show forth the glory of God. It doesn't matter what kind of baggage we come to in life from past wrongs. Jesus says, look at that. God's about to God's about to do something glorious. When I was thinking about that this morning, my mind was drawn to someone that I admire greatly, Vaughan Roberts. Some of you have maybe read his book, God's Big Picture. It's a wonderful meta-narrative approach, little, very readable book, I think less than 100 pages, and a fantastic way of putting the meta-narrative together. And he is, I don't know if it's called the rector, or he's the head guy over St. Ebbe's Church in Oxford. And my daughter was blessed for a semester to study at Oxford, and she just delighted in her time there. She had a reader's card at the Bodleian and could go into those old sacred halls and study, and I was so envious that she got to do that. And she was at Oxford, and I was coming home from Venice, where Brian used to teach some classes, and I stopped over to see her. And I believe my son was with me, and so we met her at St. Ebbe's on Easter morning. And Oxford, England, is maybe the most postmodern city in the world. The days of Christianity have passed in many places, and Oxford is one of those places, even though on the walls everywhere you see Bible verses and things about the greatness of God. That wind has changed, and the mood in Oxford, by and large, is against Christianity. But at St. Ebbe's, it's different. And I remember Easter morning when I went and met my daughter there. This was one of the most grace-filled, gracious services I'd ever been to. And I still remember the songs. They sang this song that had no rhyme to it, but the truth of it was, we're all bad people, and we do bad things, and we can't make ourselves better, but Jesus, you're great, and you can solve our problems. And I remember sitting in St. Ebbe's and hearing the political praying equally to both sides and confessing the sin of both political parties and pleading with Jesus to show grace, and so that we could pray for all of our politicians and all our leaders. And to this day, that service at St. Ebbe's was one of the best Christian experiences I've ever had. And I remember sitting there waiting for my daughter to show up, and Vaughan Roberts came and spoke to me, and I was delighted to meet him. He's a pretty famous author. Well, the interesting thing about Vaughan Roberts' life is this, that Vaughan Roberts admits that he has suffered from same-sex attraction every moment that he can remember in his life. And he says, in the power of Jesus, I have lived a celibate life, and I have not given in to those desires that I've had since I was a tiny child. I think Jesus, and I think C.S. Lewis said this same thing, that's how we should look at our challenges in life. Not, what's wrong with me? Why did I get what I got in life? But rather, this is an opportunity for the glory of God to shine. Another story I think of is a man and his wife. I admire them both. B.B. Warfield. Many of you are familiar with the term inerrancy. One of the tenets of the statement of faith at Bryan College mentions inerrancy. This is the guy who came up with that word. he's an incredible man. His maternal grandfather was the 14th Vice President of the United States, John Breckinridge. You go back in that line, his lineages include senators and secretaries of state. He's one of the brightest theological minds that America has ever produced. In fact, one of his students, J. Gresham Machen, was one of the people that Bryan College asked to be president as their first president. He had to say no, but he wrote a very kind letter declining the offer. B.B. Warfield's a great man. His wife, and I wish I could have found a picture of her. I could only find this drawing, but from all accounts, she was one of the most beautiful, charming people who lived. And she came from a background equal to Warfield. I think her father had actually, in 1855, defended Abraham Lincoln in some court case. These are two wealthy, prominent, charming, beautiful, gifted people. And they met, and they fell in love, and they married. B.B. Warfield studied in Germany, and so he, as a honeymoon gift, gave his wife their honeymoon in Germany. And the two of them were walking together on a mountain there in Germany. I think it's called the Harz Mountain. And a thunderstorm came up. And there was nowhere to go. They were just on this mountain in the middle of a thunderstorm. And nobody really knows exactly what happened, but as Annie Pearce Kinkade was shivering in B.B. Warfield's arms, some accounts say that she was struck by lightning. Other accounts say it was the thunderstorm, but something happened to her nervous system, and she became a virtual invalid for the rest of her life. These two young lovers on their honeymoon, delighting in each other, and 2 weeks, however long it was into their marriage, she becomes a virtual invalid. Some accounts say that the sharpness of her mind was still there, but one account would say on a good day she could get up and walk in the flower garden, but that was kind of the extent of what she could handle for the day. I think they were married for 40 years. And B.B. Warfield, who received invitations to speak at every place on the planet, refused to accept any of those. In fact, he never left her alone for more than 2 hours. They said that he would come home and read books that she liked for hours every day. They never had children. But in the power of Jesus, B.B. Warfield loved Annie for the rest of their lives together. When she died, he was devastated. Did he respond to the challenge of that situation in his own power? Or was it an opportunity for the glory of God to shine? Jesus views the challenges and lack that we face differently than we do. I'm convinced one of the truths that Jesus would have us take away from John 9 is just that. We all have baggage. We all have things in our lives that we wish were not true. And Jesus says this is going to be an opportunity for God's grace to shine. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no man can work. As long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and he made mud with his spit. And then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud, and he said, go wash in the pool at Siloam, which means sent. And the man went and washed and came back seeing. Now, G. Campbell Morgan said, sometimes the greatest thing you can bring to a story is a sanctified imagination. That is, get into the details of the story and feel what this was like. And if we do that, we can think about what Jesus is saying for this man to do. This is the beautiful entryway to the temple. This is the pool at Siloam. It's a long way down from the temple to the pool. Maybe think, maybe not quite fully this distance, but think of going from this room to where you turn off by the lake there, the back entrance to Bryan College. Imagine Jesus telling you as a blind person, go from here to where you turn off, is it 30 there or whatever, to come up the hill. Walk to that place, wash in the pool. And imagine that the distance from here to there, that you're doing that in downtown Nashville at lunch hour. You're going to make a long journey, and you're going to have to meet many people on the way. And remember what is on this man's eyes. Jesus spit on the ground and rubbed dirt all over this man's eyes. I want you to imagine what that journey was like down those roads. In fact, this is a picture. I wish I could find a picture for the other side of the hill. This is the wrong side of the hill, but we're standing with our backs right here to where the temple would have been. And you can see the difficulty of making a journey like that. That's a person. This is a tremendously difficult journey for this blind man to make. And if you imagine that journey, as I imagine that journey, I imagine, just imagine when classes change here, what it's like to walk from this classroom maybe down to the first floor, and you're going to run into lots of people. And imagine that you're blind, and imagine that you have muddy spit running down your eyes, and you're making your way through the crowd. Now, it could be that people would be very kind, and maybe they'd take you by the hand and walk you down there, but normally people can be jerks. And don't you imagine that people said, what's wrong with that goofball? I knew he was blind, but look at that spit on his face. Doesn't he know he needs to get to wash his eyes? He's blind, but I didn't know he was stupid too. Do you imagine he heard hurtful things like that and he made his way to the pool? This is the actual pool where Jesus sent him. It's only been recently excavated, and eventually they'll get all the dirt off, and you can see this is the main drinking water reservoir for all of Jerusalem. And Jesus is saying, go to that place and wash that muddy spit off your eyes. Well, where else in the Bible does God talk about mud? Where else in the Bible does God talk about spit? Job 10:9 says, remember that you have made me like clay. Will you return me to dust? Numbers 12:14, the Lord said to Moses, if her father had spit in her face, should she not be shamed 7 days? This is when Miriam had criticized her brother Moses for marrying a Cushite woman. And you may or may not know that Cush in the Bible is Ethiopia. And it's very likely that it was an interracial marriage. And Miriam was saying that her brother had done wrong by this. And God ended up striking Miriam with leprosy. And Moses pled and said, don't leave her like one who comes from the womb half dead. Please heal her leprosy. And the Lord said, well, even if her father had spit in her face, she would be shamed 7 days. And so she stays outside the camp 7 days, but she's healed. Spit is a bad thing in the Bible. He has made me a byword of the people. I am like one before whom men spit. Jesus was spat upon. When he died on the cross, people spit in his face. Some slapped him. They spit on him and took a reed and struck him on the head. But Jesus oftentimes will use spit when he heals someone. Jesus took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the village. When he had spit on his eyes, laid his hands, he asked, do you see anything? The man says, I see that men walking like trees. Jesus touches him again. He can see all things clearly. Probably that's foreshadowing the fact that the disciples realize Jesus is the Messiah, but they think that means a military conqueror. And Jesus has to touch them a second time to realize it was a Messiah come conquering by dying. Taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue. And I'm unclear in that account whether he spat on his hand and touched the man's mouth. That would be similar to Mark 8. I don't know. I can't tell when I studied the text, but clearly Jesus is using this thing normally associated with shame, and he's using it to heal people. The Bible talks about blindness elsewhere. To this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. How do you get ears to hear? You get it when the Lord gives it to you. This passage may be supremely important as background for the statement, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear. And Jesus repeats that over and over. Leviticus 21:17, speak to Aaron, saying, none of your offspring throughout their generations who has a blemish may approach the bread of his God, for no one who has a blemish shall draw near, not a blind man or a lame man or one who has a mutilated face or limb too long, and the list goes on. That's why these blind people and lame people and deformed people were outside the temple gate, because this law said you can't go back into the Eden of God's presence with the remnants of sin. So people seized on that and came to the conclusion that the disciples came to, but Jesus says that's not what this is about. what this is about is how God gets people back into the Eden of his presence. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. Make the heart of this people dull, make their ears dull, blind their eyes. That's what God had told Isaiah to do. But the truth is that Jesus is coming as the epitome of the meta-narrative, and he's bringing all who will come to him by faith back into the Eden of God's presence. In the ultimate place where God deals with dust is Genesis 2. In fact, if we were Hebrews and we were thinking about the story in Hebrew, Jesus would be putting Adam on the man's eyes. He rubbed Adam on the man's eyes. He rubbed shame on the man's eyes. And he said, walk down to that pool, all the way down at the entrance, and if you will wash in the sent one, you'll see. And I imagine that trip was the most vile trip the man had ever taken, because he just felt abuse from everyone who just stood in his way to get to the pool. But when he obeyed Jesus and he got to the pool, he could see. And notice Jesus says it's the pool at Siloam. It's interesting. You can translate it sent. When I look at this word, I see a reduplication here, and I see a perfect passive participle, and literally that is translated the one having been sent. Go wash in the one having been sent. And if you wash in the one having been sent, if you wash in Siloam, you'll see. You've got Adam on your eyes. You've got shame on your eyes. You've got a challenge that excludes you from the Edenic presence of God. Well, know this. If you wash in the sent one, you'll be clean. The Adam on your eyes will go away. The shame on your eyes will go away. You resist the criticism of the world, and you walk to that pool, and I can tell you this, when you get into that pool, you're going to be healed. And so the man does it, and it doesn't really look like this is true in English, but if you'll believe me, the word Shiloah and Shiloah and Siloam actually are the exact same words. In fact, when the Greek translation translates this word Siloah, the one having been sent, it translates it with this word. And it's the exact word that Jesus used when he tells the man. This passage in Isaiah 8 is talking about the Messianic king. This passage is saying you're trying to solve things on your own, but if you'll come to Shiloah, if you'll come to the sent one, if you'll come to Siloam, things will be right for you. Jesus sends the man, and when he sends the man, he can see. And it's interesting, when he comes back and he can see, where does he go? He goes into the temple. He had been excluded because of his problem, and Jesus fixed his problem, and so now he goes in, and people began to debate. Is this the man? And some said, well, yeah, that's the guy. Been there my entire life. I saw him every Sabbath day when I went in. And others said, no, it just looks like him. And he kept saying, I'm the man. I'm the guy who used to sit there. And they said, well, how did he do it? And he said, well, Jesus put mud on my eyes. And notice the man can't even bring himself to admit that Jesus put spit on his eyes too. Maybe he was a little ashamed of that. He says, Jesus put mud on my eyes, anointed my eyes, go wash Siloam. I washed and received my sight. And they say, well, where is he? And he said, I don't know. It's interesting that Jesus found the man. They kick him out. When they can't answer his testimony, they kick him out. And they tell the man, how did he do it? He said, they put mud on my eyes and I washed and I see it. Some of the Pharisees said, well, this man's not from God, for he doesn't keep the Sabbath. And I just said, well, how can a man who's a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division. And so they asked the man, what do you say? And the man says, well, I think he's at least a prophet. He couldn't do this unless he were sent from God. So I think he's at least a prophet. After they kick him out, and it's interesting, they tell a story of his parents, and his parents kind of throw Jesus under the bus. Here's somebody who healed their son who was born blind. They wouldn't even stand up for Jesus. And so they said, we know that this man's our son. We know that he was born blind, but how he sees, we do not know. Ask him, he has age. You would have hoped that they would have said, look, we're standing with Jesus, and you throw us out, and that's fine and good. You do but we're with Jesus. You would have hoped they would say something like that. But they don't. They're trying to protect themselves. And so they said, ask him, he's of age. So for the second time, they called him in and said, give glory to God. These are religious people saying this. Jesus said, this man's going to give glory to God by being healed and going around and seeing. But these religious people who don't have a new heart are corrupting that religion and say, give glory to God. We know that this man's a sinner. And the man says, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. But one thing I do know, I was blind and now I see. And then they say, what did he do to you? He answered, I told you already. You won't listen. And then he kind of becomes a smart aleck. And he says, do you want to be his disciple too? And man, they didn't like that, so they kicked him out. They threw him out of the temple. You are his disciples. We're the disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but where this man's from, we don't know. We don't even know where it comes from. And as they're kicking him out, he said, this is an amazing thing. You don't know where it comes from. And he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God, God does his will. God listens to him. Never since the beginning of the world has it been heard that anyone has opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered him, you were born in utter sin. Get out. And notice they're saying the exact same thing that the disciples said at the beginning. They were judging this man. They were assuming that they were somehow inherently better than this man. So they kicked him out. And then the beauty of this, when Jesus heard they kicked him out, he found him. Listen, if you ever do something right for Jesus, people who are religious without God are going to hate your guts. If you do something right in the power of Jesus, the people who are religious hypocrites are going to fight you tooth and nail, and they're going to kick you out. But know this, when they kick you out, Jesus is going to find you. If they throw you to the back of the line, you'll be in the back of the line, but Jesus will be there with you. Jesus said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, who is he? That I may believe in him. And Jesus said, and this is the most beautiful thing, you have seen him. You have seen him. This man hadn't seen anything before about 25 minutes ago. And now Jesus is saying, you've seen the Son of Man. He said, Lord, I believed, and he worshiped him. Religious hypocrites who try to enter the things of God without a new heart, it's always going to result in death. Jesus found this man, and he found life, and he worshiped Jesus. that's what I have for you this morning. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you on Friday.